All right, we are now in the reading task section. So in this section, we would pretty much create a structure for our task and render them to the screen. Let's first run our dev server. The command is npm run dev, and we can pretty much open this particular URL in our browser. Right, great. We see our hello world from our app.tsx. Now, talking about the types. What is the structure we want our tasks to each task to take, right? What properties does a task have? At a high level, I can think of a unique identifier for each task. What is the task about? It could be name or title. And what is the completion status? And maybe we also have a couple of optional properties on the same task, such as priority, right? So I think of my task to have this particular shape where an ID of number, it could be string or number. I'm just assuming number for now. Next up is title, which is a string. Next up is completion status. I'm naming it is completed. You could also name it completion status. And this can only take two values, which is true or false. So technically it's a Boolean. Now, I did say that we might have a optional field called priority, and it can take maybe something very specific like one of the three values of P1, P2, or P3, and it is optional. By the way, some folks prefer to explicitly state that if something is undefined, but I prefer to use the implicit way of doing it. I just feel this is better, and the other one just adds too much of cognitive load. But in my opinion, either works. Choose the one that works well with your team. Now, one more thing which I want to do is also separate these types into their own types, because I could also refer this priority in multiple areas across my code base. So I would just copy this over here and refer the priority over here. Great. We are now pretty much done with the structure for our types. Now let's create our default tasks. This is just for our reference. So let's create something called tasks. It's going to be an array of tasks. And how do I use TypeScript to tell me that it is an array of tasks? I create a task with this particular syntax. So it's an array of tasks. And I've also seen people do this. You don't have to do this. Every different type of array can take an empty array. So that is very implicit and you don't have to do it. Now, what is the structure of task? Let's add a default data for our tasks. So it's going to take some ID. You can see how autocomplete helps me. It also takes a title. Let's name it maybe learn React. And what is the is completed status? By default, let's assume it's a false. We don't have to worry about priority. It's optional, so I'm not going to add it right now. Okay, we have some default data. Now let's render it to the screen. I'm going to remove this hello world and have a h1 to indicate tasks. I'm going to have an unordered list to store my tasks, and I'm going to map across my tasks and create an individual list item and pretty much render my title over there. As you can see, we did render our task, but if you open your console, you would see a particular warning. And the warning is each child in a list should technically have a unique key. And we have a unique key, which is ID. So let's just specify that. So it's task.id. This particular key in a list lets React know that what has changed and what it has to re-render. So it's a good idea and it's a best practice to have a unique identifier for any list item. And by the way, this key error should not be there. If you refresh, yes. Now it is time to add some interactivity to our application. We can, since we need to add a task, let us add a text input and a button to enable that. First up is my input, and next is my button. Button, I'm going to label the button with simply add. Great. This is fine, but ideally we should be making it more accessible by adding a label for the input and associating that label with our input. I'm going to label it as add task. Since we need to associate it with our input, I'm going to give an ID to our input. and also link it to our label. And in order to do so, you just need to have an ID and also refer the same ID in the HTML for the label. Now, if you save and if you click on your label, it should focus on your input. Now, I want to also tell you something. Sometimes people don't like to show labels. This is very obvious that this particular input is adding tasks and a label might just be a hindrance visually. Yet, you should be having a label, but you can hide it visually. And Tailwind has a nice utility class for the same. It's called SR only. Since we are not using Tailwind, we can just create our own utility class for the same. You can copy these particular properties. I will attach this in the description. I'm copying these CSS properties and creating my own Tailwind utility class. I'm going to name it SR only and paste the CSS properties. I'll also give my label this class. Cool. Now you can see that the label is gone. It is still present, but it's just visually hidden. If you inspect it with DOM, there if you inspect it, it is still present, but it is announced by screen readers. Now, why are we adding these many CSS properties? Can't we simply do a display none? Display none also hides it visually. Though this is now still present in the DOM, this is not announced by screen readers. Display none technically means, yeah, do not display anything, even for screen readers. So that is the reason we have this particular hacky CSS, but you get the idea. Now, I'm not a huge fan of hiding my labels. If you want to hide it, do add the class back. I'm going to remove it for my sake. The add button doesn't do much as of now. Let's try to log something to a console whenever we click on the button. I'm just going to simply log added. Now, if I click on my button, you can see the logs. So our button works or on click is working. What are we supposed to add to our list? We need to add a task and we are tracking the task in our input. And in order to do so, we need to bring in state. There are two different ways to track this particular input. One is through state and the other is through a ref. Ideally, state is the most preferred solution. Refs work in some cases and there might be use case for ref, but usually state works better because you would ideally want to do more with that than just grab the value. So for now, we'll be using state. And in React, we can get state through a hook called useState. And make sure you import React. The useState provides us with two values. One, a value and a setter for that value. In this case, I want to name my value as task name and the setter as set task name. This is pretty much the convention across React. Now I also know that the default value is an empty string. You are supposed to give a default value for inputs at least. So given an empty string as a default value. Now, how do I make my input controlled? I just assign the value of task name to the value of the input. The input also provides me with the on change where I can track what the changes are. I'm simply going to assign the current value to the task name. Now let us also log the tracked value. You do see a particular error, a warning over here. That is because I added the value first and did not add the on change. You can just refresh and that warning should go away. Cool. Now let's type something in the input and click on add. You can see that we are now tracking the value. Great. But before we can add a task to the list of tasks, we need to make sure that our current task variable is also state. Otherwise, these updates will not render to screen. So let's also bring in state over here. Again, pretty much the same API. We have a value of task and a setter for that tasks. Cool. Now, how do I tell React useState that my task has a particular structure? You can do it as an argument over here. Now that we are tracking a state of tasks, we can also add to our tasks. Now, I don't want to lose my previous tasks, so I'm going to spread out all my previous tasks and also add the new task now. My new task has an ID. Usually this comes from a database. Whenever you add, the database returns you an ID. That is how you get the ID over here. Here we don't have a database, so it's okay to use something like date.now. or maybe new date dot get time method. Next up is title, which is nothing but a task name. And we also have something called completion status, which is completed. I know that it is false by default, and we are pretty much good to go. Let's try it out. I'm gonna type learn test driven development. It works. But now you see that this is pretty messy, JSX at least. Maybe I could abstract some of this into its own function, at least for the button. So I'm gonna call it on at task and pretty much copy this logic over there and just refer this on at task over here. This is fine, but you can already see that we can make a couple of improvements. For example, whenever we add a new task, our input doesn't get cleared. That is one improvement we can make. Next up, there's a small bug over here. I can add empty tasks. We should not be able to do this. Also, whenever I type something in the input and press enter, nothing happens. Ideally, I would want it to add my task onto the list. We can go ahead and write this code to solve these particular issues, but this gives us a good opportunity to learn about test driven development. And we'll do that in the next section. Before that, let us also commit our existing work. I'm going to just call it adding tasks.